don't have many people talking about Cyprus.
Okay.
I'd like to hear about Cyprus as kind of, in the beginning there was Cyprus.
Yeah.
So tell me a bit about that tour. What were things like in Cyprus when you went in the late 80s?
In Cyprus itself? So, I mean, the Turks and the Greeks hadn't got along since the mid-60s. Then the last sort of big strike was in the early 70s. And I was there in 88 to 89, so it had been a while. But it was still not good, like in that green zone area, it wasn't good. And it was mostly political issues, I would say, the grieving mothers looking for their sons on the other side because they were still prisoners, that type of stuff. They were still not allowed, both the Greeks and the Turks had occupied, the green line, and they had so many barrels, so many sandbags, we'd count them every day, and they would get excited if one more barrel showed up because they were fortifying. Those kinds of disputes were handled at the mass corporal level. But I mean, we had trained for that in Canada, not as long as we train now. It was probably about 2 weeks of workup training, and then we went. And previous to that workup training, we actually were in Wainwright on WayneCon, RV type exercises, the long ones. So I mean, it was just soldiering, and then we just sort of broke down into the new formations because it wasn't just in the Strathconas, and we had A and B squadron, which were sort of formed on tank squadron type scale, but we had rural squadron and city squadron, so they were much bigger because there were more people required to man the OPs and the like. It was a great tour. It was challenging leadership-wise, and mass corporals were given a certain amount of responsibility to deal with problems as they arose. It was a good time.
Just to go back to that's great for the context of it, and just to go back to the beginning. Like you're obviously a much younger soldier at the time. What's your reaction at the time? What's your attitude personally when you find out that you're going to Cyprus?
Excited. Everyone was pumped. Everyone wanted to do it. It was all being overseas is something you joined for. Staying in Canada is fine, but everyone was waiting to be told that you were going on something real. And this was it. Back in the 80s, that was it. We didn't have many other tours to deploy on as far as what people call like the battle group type tours now. I mean, it was regimental tours, and they were in Cyprus, and that was about it. So, in my lifetime, so that was a big deal, and it was met with excitement, and nobody wanted to be left behind. Nobody.
Was it at the time? Was it so routine that you weren't concerned about personal safety issues heading over there? What was that like?
And again, hindsight, I think we were concerned, probably not as concerned as we should have been, maybe, but compared to nowadays, it's totally different. It's a totally different world. So back then, we were very careful. We were very aware of where we were going and what we were supposed to do. And you were put in between two people who literally hated each other, and you had a rifle. We didn't have any body armor or any of that stuff, and it was just, you were given that sort of autonomy to deal with the situation and calm people down. And we were really good at it.
And yet, like you said, you did like a WayneCon, RV, whatever, and then you did 2 weeks of workup training?
Yeah.
Which by today's standards seems incredible.
And yet, I find workup training isn't for me. It's not for the soldier, I find. We all know first aid. We know how to do the warfighting. Like, we did the WayneCon, that was a warfighting exercise. But everybody gelled. So, the pre-deployment training, I find, is for the headquarters, because there's a lot of people that aren't from the regiment or, the battle group. They have to bolt them in, and that's where they have to be given problems and learn who to talk to, how each other works. The best pre-deployment training I ever was on was in '97. We went to Wainwright before we were going to Bosnia in '97. That was for the NATO mission. And Winnipeg flooded. We had to stop training, packed everything up, and drove to Winnipeg, saved Winnipeg, and then we drove back to Wainwright. Well, by the time we got back to Wainwright, we didn't need to do any pre-deployment training after that, because we'd been in Winnipeg, forced to work together in a complex environment with many different tasks that, it was just for the headquarters to gel. By the time we left Winnipeg, no issue at all.
So what are your first impressions of Cyprus when you get there as a young soldier?
It was exciting, it was foreign, it was hot, we were in the Mediterranean. I got there in the beginning of July, and it was, it was tropical, it's hot, and foreign, and that's the exciting part. That's what we were looking for. As we got, we landed on the south side of the island, got on the buses, went up to Nicosia, where, you issued your weapons and your ammo and all that, and figured out where you were sleeping and doing all that stuff, and that was cool. Like, it was just how it should have, how everyone envisioned it should be. And we sort of rehearsed, packing up and doing all our admin back in Canada. So there was no surprises. You knew the guys in your troop, and you knew who you were working for, and I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it.
Why do you think you said that we were good at it, being in between the peacekeeper, in between the Greeks and the Turk Cypriots? Why do you think Canadians excelled at that?
I think, don't get me wrong, I think Canadian soldiers, we've got it. I think we have the perfect balance between, citizen and soldier. We're common sense people. We're not too excitable. But what makes a Canadian soldier the best is because he's Canadian. Being a Canadian is what makes you the umpire of the world, I guess. Common sense. We've all played hockey, you've lost teeth somewhere in a parking lot. What a hard hit is at a very young age, and I think that pays dividends, and it makes us very smart. I find Canadian soldiers to be much smarter than most.
So what was your specific job? What were you doing day to day in Cyprus?
I worked in the city, and I was a troop sergeant in RHQ, so I multitasked. I did many different jobs. I didn't have a line job per se. So there's a lot of different things going on. I was the officer's mess manager. I was in RHQ, so there's a lot of different parts in that.
Officer's mess manager. Talking to Colonel Weidlich, who was giving me a bit of a sense of the social calendar for officers in Cyprus. What was your impression of that? What kinds of things were on the agenda?
Well, especially the officer's mess. It was, I would say the officer's mess that, there were messes all over the island, obviously, but the one in the city, in Wolseley Barracks where we were, that was sort of where the official entertaining went on, because that's where the colonel was. So, any visitors that we were sort of obligated to host, if you will, with, sort of waving that UN and Canada flag, that's where it all happened. So it was, that's where the official visiting, I guess, and the official receptions, the official cocktail parties, mess dinners, all those types of things, they all happened in that mess. So socially, between contingents, it was sort of a good guy agreement. You'd invite the Brits over, the Danes, and build reputation, or build relationships between the contingents and between the headquarters, and then as well, the British Sovereign base area that was in the Greek side down south there, in Akrotiri, and so I can't remember the other place now. Inik, I think it's called. But anyway, there were people that you would entertain and host, and they would reciprocate. But there's a lot of political. There was an election when we were there. There was a couple of sort of riots and uprisings while we were there, and they they happened in the city, obviously, because that's where the press is, right? There was a Turkish soldier killed there when we were there by a Greek, right? So that's, you know, just escalating the tension, you know, and then you got to calm everybody down, and it was a busy tour. I mean, it went by like nothing. It was fast.
I mean, for younger soldiers today, right, the new guys, they would, I think, be a little bit baffled by the social obligations that you described. What did you think as a young sergeant at the time?
I thought it was necessary. I mean, I understood why we were there. I think everybody did. And, you know, being in the regiment at the time, it was your entire life anyway. So whether we were in Calgary or in Cyprus, we just assumed it was going to be like that. And there was a need to do that, because in the Warrant Officers and Sergeants Mess, we also did similar things, not to the grand scale that the Officers Mess did, but, you know, we still hosted the Australian civil police guys who were in Nicosia. You know, they were great guys, and we worked with them, and so we would invite them in. You know, we'd have barbecues and the like, and the RCMP that were in Cyprus at the time, they would come. So I mean, it was a good relationship. It was just relationship building, because everything we did was based on talking people out of doing something ridiculous, like, you know, starting another riot or whatever. So it was, like I say, it was always busy. There was always something going on, and it was challenging, and you never really knew how, you know, the Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots would react to whatever it was their political agenda was, which we didn't read a lot into. We just knew what had happened and what we needed to do to get it done. Is there a day, an incident that stands out in your memory as being memorable even now? I mean, there were some great fun times, I guess, and when I say fun, I mean, you know, really militarily busy times, like during the riots, where you see people on their game, and they're firing on all cylinders, and things were just working, and you see leaders in positions, and they're doing what they should be doing, and you know, you get excited about that, eh? Like I do anyway. You know, I like to see that. The day the Turkish soldier was shot, that was just outside Leidra Palace, where I lived, and that was a big deal. You know, there's a lot of scurrying around, but not as big, I think, as like during the riots, when you were seeing people doing their job, you know, and calm, cool, collected, just professional. Yeah, made me proud anyway. Yeah.
So that the training, the Army, the way it was then, the kind of the regiment deploying as a regiment, that all sounds like that all worked.
Yes.
At the time, right? So when you're in that, when you leave that behind, what's it like to come back to Canada, to go back to peacetime soldiering?
I think by the time we left, we were ready to go. Then it was starting to get boring, if you want. You know, it's routine, and this guy's doing this again, like you just want to slap him, you know, like you can't do those things, but it's just the way you feel, like, you know, I got to get out of here, I need a change, right? So there was that. I think, you know, I was on the advance party and the rear party, so I was there sort of that longest crew, because we had accounts to hand over and the like. Coming home was, you know, you're obviously anxious to get home, but once you're home, and then you sort of, everyone goes on leave, I missed everybody. You know, when we came back from leave, everyone was very glad to be back, I think. You know, we had 2 whole weeks off, and right after we got home, we went back to Wainwright. We were 2 weeks off. We were back in garrison for about 5 or 6 days, and then we went to Wainwright for WayneCon.
Is there anything you haven't said about Cyprus that you want to say?
Do I have, sorry?
Is there anything you haven't said about Cyprus that you want to say about your sort of first experience overseas?
I mean, I cherish it. You know, I look back on Cyprus fondly. I think most guys do. It was, you know, compared to the last 3 tours, it was a great time to be young, I think, you know, and we were just young guys doing stuff, and it was exciting, and living the dream kind of thing. It was good. Yeah.
So moving forward, can you set the scene for me now? What's going on in the early '90s, a couple years later, before you go into Bosnia? What's kind of the situation that you're about to step into?
So I was in the French regiment, so the 12e RBC, and I had, oddly enough, been sent back to Calgary to teach on the militia concentration. So they ran the course out of Calgary, and then we went to Suffield to go to the field and practice the summer before I deployed. And everyone was following General Mackenzie and the Canadians who were in Sarajevo at the time. And then their subsequent, they were getting ready to come out of there. And so we didn't think too much. We sort of thought that was all over and it was just going to be another training year. And I was in Calgary. I was listening to the guys in the Strathconas talk about it. I went back to Quebec and back to the regiment, and everyone was talking about it as if it was over, and there was no talk about workup training or potential for us to go. And then before you know it, we heard that the Canadians were going back, and it was 5 Brigade, and we were going, and I was in A Squadron at the time. And it was A Squadron tank, and we re-rolled to reconnaissance, so a different structure. It was very fast, and then we went to Gagetown to do our workup training, and there was, I want to say about 2 or 3 weeks of workup training. And then because we were going in our own equipment, because no one was there yet, we had to come back, have the vehicles all painted white, make sure everything worked. So they pretty much stripped everything out of the regiment. There was a Cougar at the time. To get everything working, to get 21 Cougars working, it totally tapped out the regiment of spare parts and good guns and the like. And then, so that was quite hectic, trying to get all the training and all the, the needle appointments and first aid training and gunnery courses and all that. Realizing I was going into that situation with my C5 machine gun, that was a bit disappointing. I was going into a zone like that in a Cougar, which was a tank trainer. It was not a fighting vehicle. That was also disappointing. We had asked if we could get the C6 machine guns put in the turrets, which came with the Cougar turret when we bought it, and that wasn't happening. So we were going in with the crappiest machine gun we had. The 76 cannon was a good weapon, especially for where we were going, and a wheeled vehicle was, I think, what we needed there. So that was exciting. Again, it's what you joined for. It was foreign, and we were going to go do stuff, and that was, and it didn't have the same feel as Cyprus. I know that. Nobody thought it was going to be like Cyprus. So I don't know where that came from. We just knew that it wasn't going to be, the hot tropical buffer zone kind of thing. However, we were still United Nations troops, I guess, if you want. And then we deploying in November. That was a bit hectic too. It was starting to get cold in Canada. Gagetown is mucky at the best of times, so it was hard to do sort of the off-road training, which turned out we didn't really need anyway. It was everything we did was on the hard pack in the Balkans. We were part of an RCR battle group. So normally the 12 RBC doesn't work with the RCR. They worked with the Van Du. So there was a lot of making up relationships and how we were going to work together, because there was my squadron and the engineer squadron, the signalers. They were all French from 5 Brigade, but 2 RCR was also part of 5 Brigade at the time. So they were from Gagetown, and that's who we were working for. So the language wasn't a barrier, but it just took some getting used to, I guess.
So you mentioned General Mackenzie. I mean, by this time, we know, from watching Yugoslavia fall apart, right? Yeah, much more volatile part of the world. what was it like in terms of personal safety concerns amongst for you and your fellow soldiers, for your families, as you're heading off now to this part of the world?
That was the unknown at that time. So when I went to Cyprus, I was single, and by now I'm married, and I already have a little boy, and my wife's pregnant with turned out to be the second boy. So that was different. Leaving home took on a whole different context. Again, exciting, and it's sort of what I am, what I wanted to do, what I knew was duty and the right thing to do. But leaving your family behind is also like terrible. It's so heart-wrenching, and it's really bad, especially with children. And the older they got, the harder it got to leave.
What about the fact that some people have commented to me that some of the stuff they saw in Croatia, Bosnia was harder because they were now a father. Did you find that at all?
That's the worst, yeah. The big takeaway for me was, how human beings can do that to each other. That blew me away. And the children. Lots and lots of dead children, mutilated children, and also children who are carrying AK-47s and pistols, and they're pointing them at you. You're never sure if they're going to pull the trigger. Who do they belong to? What side are they on? How do they view me? Terrible, terrible times. Yeah.
What are your first impressions when you finally hit the ground?
Well, you knew that there was a war going on for sure. Even in Zagreb airport, there's bullet holes everywhere, and there's smoke in the horizon. Houses on fire, cities on fire. Yeah, you knew it wasn't going to be easy, especially arriving like that and finding out when we hit the ground that where we were supposed to go is not where we're going now, because that whole city was on fire and it doesn't exist anymore. Where we were going to occupy, the sort of the hangar and the warehouse, that wasn't there anymore. So we needed to think of a different place to go, and that took a couple of weeks.
And where were you supposed to go initially?
Banja Luka is where we were initially supposed to go, and then we, after they re-recce'd and the political situation, I guess, warranted that we be closer to Sarajevo, so we established our camp outside Sarajevo in a place called Visoko.
So what kinds of what is your job on this tour?
So on that tour, I was a troop warrant of a reconnaissance troop, so 7-car, 3-man crews, recce troop. So we were doing vigilance patrols, I guess. So we were either escorting humanitarian aid, fuel, which was a guarded commodity, obviously, you can imagine, and that fuel was aircraft fuel for the one helicopter we had in theater, and that was in Tuzla, and that was owned by the British Army. So the fuel came in to Split, and we had to escort it right across the country and then all the way up. So it was the Canadians who did that. UNHCR convoys, a lot of those. Some NGO convoys. They were just random, Germany, Britain, France, they all had food. And then vigilance patrols, so we would just surge out and we would go places where, based on the int that we were getting, you'd get a feel for where things might be going wrong quick. And so we would sort of surge in there, just, if nothing else, to be witness to humanitarian crimes. And, if we were there, maybe they would stop, maybe they wouldn't. So you just get yourself right in the middle and see what you could do. Yeah, so we did a lot of that.
So what's that like in this context? Now you're, as you said, you're forcing yourself in between the two or three warring sides.
Right. So yeah, there were 3. And that's complicated too, because it's not just, one and the other, which Cyprus, you had 2 sides, this side you had 3. So it's not even like a checkerboard, it's just a maze of who's where, and every village you went through had a different sort of owner, whether it was a Muslim village, or Serb village, or Croat village, and they could all be within, a couple of kilometers of each other, but, whoever survived, I guess, in that village, the dominant church, the dominant religious structure that was remaining standing, told you who owned the town. Getting in the middle, that took some doing initially, because you didn't really understand what was going on, but once you see things sliding sideways fast, just driver advance, get in there, and then we would see, they would run away initially, but even after a while they became so brazen they didn't care whether you were watching or not, and that's hard to swallow, especially for the young guys, right?
So was there an incident that stands out for you, a particular day, a mission?
Small town. It was on the side of a mountain, Vitez, nowhere, Bosnia, but it sort of reminded me of like a small alpine town. Could be anywhere in the Rockies here or somewhere in Switzerland, that type of flavor. And we'd go through these big tunnels to get there. And I remember going through it early in the morning, because we would go on like days patrols, so we'd be gone from the camp for days and days. And it was early morning, the sun sort of just breaking, and it's a beautiful little town, and nothing had happened there. And I thought, wow, there's a little oasis of humanity and good governance or whatever. And later on that evening we went back through that town, and it looked totally different. And there was nothing but bodies on the road, and it's still smoldering, and you can still hear the shots being fired. You get out and you try and sort it out, and it's just, there's nothing you can do. So the sense of helplessness, just that day I felt bad. It was hard to get myself moving again, because you just like felt so fucking hopeless, like just, yeah, I don't look fondly on any of those events. So it was more than a half a year of my life watching all that unfold. I wasn't a fan of that. Super proud of my squadron and the way we handled it, but yeah, it was tough. Yeah.
And what's it like for you this time? You're not the mess manager. You're responsible for young soldiers in this troop, right? Oh, squadron.
Well, I was in troop. Yeah.
Troop warrant. Pardon me. Yeah, I mean, but now you've got more personal responsibility for soldiers in a much more dangerous situation. What's that like? How old are you at the time?
I am 29.
Okay.
Newly promoted warrant officer. I was WSC'd in theater, actually. That's how that rolled. Sorry, what was the question?
I'm just curious, like that responsibility now on your shoulders.
Right. Yeah, and in my second language, so that was a bit of a challenge. But again, I think being Canadian, I took the challenge to go to the French regiment. As being in the Armour Corps, you can change regiments and do that. And I do not regret any of that. That was one of the best times of my life with those guys. But in my second language, all those young guys, and they're all looking at you, because you're the warrant, you're the old guy, and I was 29. They're looking at you when things going sideways, and like, warrant, fix this. You grow up fast. I felt I did anyway. I don't know if I did, but I certainly felt like I changed. And my wife at the time, my ex-wife now, but she had said, I was completely different when I came home. Yeah, that was, so things changed me. I was much more abrupt, very, very decision-oriented when I came home, as opposed to being, halfway fuzzy on different things. We're going this way. Well, how about this way? Nope, this is the way we're going, and there will be no questions. Like, that's what we're doing. And that's a skill I think I learned when I was there, because there was no second guessing. You make a decision and just make it the best decision, and away we went. And everyone survived in my troop, so good to go. I must have done something right.
What about other any other issues coming home in terms of, because of the stuff that you saw, the stuff you smelled, things like that? What was it like making that transition?
That's hard. I don't think any of us really handled it well, and I don't think Canada was ready. I don't think Canada knew we were there, for one thing. I mean, we didn't laud our soldiers back then. We weren't as well received, by the Canadian population. People didn't like us as much as they do now. So you came home, sort of under cover of darkness. Your wife met you. There was a bit of a reception center, and there was quickly disperse. Get out of here, go home. Came home, and the rapidity with which we got back was phenomenal. So I didn't really sleep, and then all of a sudden I was home. And so I was really tired, and so when I went to bed, I still was sort of there, I guess. And that did affect me. But I think what really affected me was I came back in May, and I left Quebec in July, because I was posted back out west. And then I didn't even come back to the Strathconas. I was posted to Wainwright as an instructor. So I had no friends who were with me there. I had no one out west at the time had been to Bosnia. Some guys had been to Croatia, but not to Bosnia. So nobody really knew what I was talking about. On top of that, the year I was posted, it was 1993, and that's the post-Somalia disbandment of the airborne regiment. So where did all the disgruntled airborne sergeants go? Was Wainwright, because all the battalions were full of sergeants, and they had a commando's worth of NCOs and no job for them in the battalion. Then they weren't very happy to be in Wainwright to begin with, right? So it was coming home from that tour was the worst, because I was separated from everyone who meant anything to me, and I couldn't talk to anybody out here, out west, right? It wasn't until, the Western unit started to rotate through there that they kind of figured out what I was talking about, I guess, I drank too much, just what you do, I guess. It was how I think we thought we were fixing the problem. Just get drunk, let it all out, and then you'll be okay in the morning. It's sort of, it used to work, I guess, but it's certainly not the way to do anything. That was tough, yeah. But what saved me, I think, was my children. 2 little boys. They keep you busy. They're fun to be around. They're always excited. And then while I was in Wainwright, my daughter was born, and that was, another dynamic to your life that I think, as a dad anyway, that you need. You need sort of boys and girls as little people, and it just balances it all out and sort of makes you realize what's really important in the world. And that was, coming back from Bosnia the first time, that was really tough. Wasn't good.
Do you think that tour is responsible in part for your subsequent divorce from your wife at the time?
Yeah, I think that was the start of it, for sure. And it wasn't so much, initially you've changed, but then you get back into reality, but again, some of the core things inside you don't change. You never unremember, you'll always remember those super terrible times, the super scary times, super frightening times, rocket attacks and and the like, mortar attacks, being caught in artillery barrage, zorching down the road trying to, bring all these food convoy trucks, and people are trying to blow trucks up at the same time. It's again, super exciting, but it wears on you after a while. We had no comms with home, I remember that. So my squadron, we had an excellent signal sergeant. And Jerry, before we left, he knew we would need the CFARS. I don't know if you remember that, but it was that ham radio network. And so you can talk, I love you, over, and then it would transfer through all these ham radio operators, and they would just flick the switch so she could talk back, and it would just flow through. And Jerry established his network of ham operators and a schedule, and then we did it with a bare wire antenna at night, and Jerry spent his whole nights trying to, through volunteer ham radio operators, so that guys could talk to their wives at home on this ham radio. And we were the only ones that had that because of Jerry. He was an amazing signaler. He was a communicator, a real guy. So we had no comms. Never talked to anybody once while I was gone. There was only one sat phone, and that was the battle group commander who had that. So, nobody had mail, comms, nothing. It was, you were put in a sea can and shipped off, and we'll see what happens, right? Yeah.
Is there anything about that tour that you haven't talked about that you want to say?
If you can ever remember yourself growing up, that was when I grew up, in that period of time. The realization of how fallible I am, how weak the human body is, how strong the human body is, and how resilient you can be when you want to be. That I saw, those guys that you thought would never make it and they were weak or whatever, and those guys seemed to rise to the top, and the guys who you thought had it all going on and weren't. That was my realization, that one there. That tour was a big eye-opener for me about myself, really.
What about, can you make any observations about working with French troops as opposed to the English troops in the Strats that you went over with the Cyprus?
There's no difference. None whatsoever. Great guys. I have nothing bad to say about any of them. No, they were good. Yeah, they were really good. I have nothing bad to say about them. Got tons of time for them.
So then you go, your third tour is Bosnia again, right?
Correct, yeah.
So this time around, now the Dayton Peace Accord signed, it's a much more peaceful country.
Yes.
What was it like?
The NATO tour. So I knew what it was like. We went in 97, 98, so the Peace Accord had been in place for quite a while. They were having an election that year that we were there, so we were going to be there for the ballot collection and the setting up of the election, which was a bit of a challenge. We had sort of done some of that in Cyprus, but this was obviously a bit different. I had been to Bosnia before, but knew I wasn't going back to Visoko, and it was a totally different thing. And then on top of it, I was the transport warrant for the battle group. So it was a bit of a different job. And that included like flight manifests and getting everything over there. The equipment was already there, but all our weapons and all the people had to. I was the transport warrant. So getting all the guys over there, flight manifests, dealing with the Air Force, and then looking at, sort of, because the ballot boxes, that was all the transport responsibility, resupplying all the different camps that we had, that was all transport. you know, the shitter truck, that was a Transport 1, POL, ration delivery, all that stuff was Headquarters Squadron Transport. So that was a bit of a different job. And challenging. I had another, so I was again a troop warrant of a troop of 35 guys, and half were in one camp and half in another. So that was, and then the transport officer ended up being the sort of camp 2IC, I guess, of Zagon, and I was in Koralichi. So they were about 4 hours apart. So I did all the transport because I was with the headquarters of the Headquarters Squadron, I guess. So I answered for the transport for the battle group while he did all the other stuff as far as being the camp mayor and, you know, it's like all that stuff.
So what are your impressions of the country now? You go back to it as 5 years, give or take, since you were there during the conflict itself. What are your impressions?
So, you know, lots of the same burned out Bosnian buildings, only they're hollow. The roofs are gone. But if they're burned out, there's nobody living in them anymore, and there's nobody camped near it either, or it's a renovation site. So I often thought, you know, if I was going to go back, if I'd have known, I'd go back either as a dentist or I'd own a home depot, because the amount of renovations that were going on was incredible. And they still made their homes out of brick. There was a bit smaller than cinder block, but the same type of construction. You know, rock carpenters making window sills and glass and clay tile roofs. But that was the first time I'd seen asphalt shingles in Europe was there. And that's because there was such a demand for roofing materials that they had asphalt shingles. Yeah, that was different. But I saw a change in the people too, obviously. I think they were sick and tired of it, and they just wanted to get on with their lives and be left alone. So there was no eye contact, you know, no one cared. They weren't happy to see you, or you were just irrelevant. So they were very good at seeing you but not seeing you, not registering you, I guess, or acknowledging your existence. You were just part of the scenery.
Is there a day or a moment that stands out for you this time?
No, I just remember being really, really busy all the time. I was just constantly, you know, moving trucks around and getting stuff done. And during the election, it was just a hotbed of activity. And after the election, where I thought it would sort of calm down, then we were rolling into Christmas and moving stuff around in the winter. You know, they get snow and the roads are red, and, you know, all those issues. So trying to get stuff up the mountains where the radio rebroadcasting stuff is, and, you know, we had soldiers up there doing all that. So it was a challenge, and again, you know, it's the soldiers that made the difference.
Is it, for you, was it kind of a relief to you to be going into that kind of environment this time after what you'd experienced the last time? Yeah,
I mean, you get excited to go. Again, it's foreign, but I'd been there before. And so I'd been there before, but I hadn't been there before, I guess, because it was different. It was almost like a different country. Because the first time you're there, obviously, everything's new, but they were at war. And then the second time, it was just the post-war after effect, you know, a lot of rebuilding, but people were moving around freely, doing what they wanted, what they needed to do, you know, people shopping, and there were a few restaurants showing up, you know, and people's businesses are coming back alive. And so, I mean, there was hope and those types of things, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, did you feel like your efforts, Canada's efforts, were making a difference in what you saw, with what you saw on the ground?
I think so, yeah. Yeah. Yes. I would say if it was going to be done properly, I found that we were doing it. Whereas if it was just something where they needed a military presence, I found some other countries were involved. But generally, if you wanted something done right, it was us or the Brits that were doing it. Yeah. Yeah.
And was your return home this time as speedy as it was?
It was as speedy, but obviously not as dramatic. But I was really glad to be home. Now I had 3 children, and you know, I miss them the most. I think, you know, it was good to be home. Yeah, it was a good homecoming then.
Was the comms back and forth during your tour, had they improved by that
Oh
time?
yeah, we had a phone call a week kind of thing. I think you had 15 minutes and put your name on a list, and you were given a time, and you made a point of doing it. And I was a transport warrant, so I was sort of in the camp most of the time. I mean, I go out during the day and do stuff, but I was usually back in the camp for the night, so I was always close to the phone. But you had to make sure the younger soldiers had the chance. So I limited myself to 1 a week, just so that I wasn't taking more advantage of it, I guess, or to be seen to be less leaderly.
When did you go to Afghanistan?
2004, 2005.
So this is Kabul?
Correct.
Yeah. So what was that? What's your role at that time?
So I was a squadron sergeant major of Recce Squadron in the Strathconas in Canada, and they were looking for a Recce Squadron to go over. So Canada had a battle group, a Vandu battle group in theater at the time, so 5 Brigade, and we were going over as only the Recce Squadron was going to be attached to the Kabul multinational brigade. So it was a Franco-German brigade commander. So it was a German brigade commander with a French deputy, like the 2 were together. And it was a NATO mission, I guess, if you want, of the most multicultural type. But the Canadians had their own camp, because we lived in the Canadian camp that was meant for the battle group. And then some of the NATO countries moved into Camp Julian at the time, but we were in a different part of Kabul. And what that was all about was the battle group was pulling out, we were put in, and that was to the Recce Squadron, so it's surveillance, to watch the election. And that was the first time that President Karzai was elected to be the president of Afghanistan. So it was the first ever Afghan election, which is a big deal. A lot of international hope, I guess, and a lot of pressure too, right?
What was the security situation in the country at that time when you were there?
Yeah, it was pretty tense. I mean, Taliban were everywhere. And it was at that sort of feeling each other out phase before, you know, when we moved down south, and then it was a slugfest, right? But up north during the election, no one really knew who was who kind of thing, and it was a very, you know, sparring, feeling each other out type thing. And our squadron, we surged out. We didn't spend very much time in the city. We spent a lot of time out of the city, because you could feel and see where things were happening. You know, all the bad guys, I mean, they're easy to see. Once you're there for a while, you look around and you know who's who. And so you just keep them off balance the whole time while that election was going on. At least it could go on, you know, and they would decide who won. We didn't really care about that. It was just more keeping them on their toes. That's what we did do. So it was a busy time. It was awesome. It was really good.
Yeah, it's your completely new environment again.
Yeah.
I mean, what did you think when you hit the ground there and initially just started doing your job?
Being the sergeant major of a Recce Squadron, I can say, is the best job in the world. It is by far, hands down, the greatest job. Everyone is out doing, you know, it's very independent, and guys are doing their own thing. We had 166 guys in the squadron. You know, we had a platoon from 3 PPCLI that was embedded into the squadron. We had like communicators, signalers from the French Army that were attached to the squadron, because we were linking with the French were working up north of the city, so we needed them to link with that. It was We had a platoon from the Slovenian Special Forces. They were attached to the squadron. You know, we had lots of different electronic pieces in the squadron that, you know, we won't boast about, but I tell you, it was all the assets you could want. They were all there at the same time, and everyone was firing on all cylinders. It was amazing to watch people come into their own. And I could see myself in different soldiers, and that experience I had in the first tour in Bosnia, it was watching them go through all those machinations in their brains, you know, trying to wrap their head around weird situations like that, and seeing guys come into their own like that, I was never happier. Yeah, that was a really proud moment for me, for sure. Yeah, that was an excellent tour.
What was the most memorable day of that tour?
Oh gosh. I don't know. There's a lot I can remember, and I'm sure parts of it sucked, but I just can't remember that anymore. I can only remember the good stuff from that tour. There was some really scary stuff, you know, just where your heart's in your throat kind of stuff. But I couldn't honestly say there's one thing that I took away, other than the general feeling of total satisfaction and pride in myself and my choice of career and the soldiers I was with. And I can still name names and faces and, you know, funny jokes and situations and scary situations and hard work and, you know, young faces. That's the one thing I do remember is the young guys and, you know, Sergeant Major, what do I do? Yeah, that's a good feeling. Yeah.
What about reservists on these tours? When you went to Cyprus or Bosnia, Afghanistan, to what extent were you augmented by reservists?
Cyprus, we had quite a few. There were 2 full troops of reservists, and it started out that they were like a reserve troop in City Squadron and one in Rural Squadron. And that didn't work because they weren't all from one unit, and it just didn't work. So they broke up and just redistributed everybody and reformed that troop. So they pulled regular guys from different troops, and so the numbers were all jumbled together, and they just distributed all the reservists throughout the squadron, and then it worked much better. So I think, you know, and nobody really didn't like the reservists. I think that that reserve troop didn't work. They worked much better just on one-on-one replacing different soldiers doing different jobs. I mean, soldiers are soldiers, and so once they were morphed into whatever 2 troop consisted of, then it seemed to work fine. First tour to Bosnia, we had 1 reservist who was a master corporal, and that was it. We only had the 1. And then the second tour to Bosnia, I don't think we had any, to be honest. And we didn't have any in Afghanistan either. But that was sort of all firsts, I guess. So the reservists didn't sort of come in until, you know, tour 2 or 3 or whatever. Yeah, that was it for reservists.
So when you look back at your experiences across those 4 tours, are there particular lessons that stand out for you, or trends in terms of the evolution of the Army and the way it does things? Any observations that way?
When we were doing the RV exercises in Wainwright, as much as everybody hated going away for 3 months to live in a tent or live in the back deck of your vehicle, that was the Army I grew up in, and we were really good at going to the field and looking after ourselves. All the sergeant majors knew how to pick a hide, how to pick squadron bivouac, whether it was tactical or non-tactical. Showers, how to feed ourselves out of a kitchen, like the flying kitchens, and the evolution of that equipment, I guess, and POL trucks, and how to administer and fix your own equipment and look after yourself and wash your coveralls and do all that stuff. We did all that by hand, and we did it all together. And I find now, especially post-Afghanistan, nobody seems to know how to live in the field anymore or do their job, and we just seem to fall into this FOB mentality where if the FOB's not set up, no one knows how to set one up. We don't know how to administrate ourselves anymore because I don't think we do it well anymore at the lower level. I've just realized that the immersion heaters that we used in Cyprus, in Bosnia for both tours, they don't exist anymore because there's some kind of a safety hazard now, as opposed to like they weren't back then. And they were so versatile and so handy to have around that at the section level you could set up an immersion heater and everyone could have a hot wash. Like in the middle of the night, it didn't matter, you get that thing going, and 4 or 5 guys could get a really good bath going or get themselves cleaned up, especially if you're really dirty or cold. It's just that morale factor where, as the mass corporal or the sergeant of a small group, you could get things happening by doing simple things like that, getting some soup in you, get guys to ground, do all that stuff. And now we seem to wait for the bigger entity to look after me, and that's not always good, right? I find we spend far too much time wishing we were American instead of just being Canadian, which is what we used to be. And when we were Canadian, we just looked after ourselves and did our own thing the way we knew we could do it, because we're a small army and we realize that. What part can we play? How can we help? But pretending that we're bigger than we really are, that's not the answer either. So the takeaway lessons was we used to look after ourselves. And in that, I mean, look after ourselves, know your men, promote their welfare. And knowing your men, that doesn't happen with one interview in your little book, right? I mean, you need to do stuff with people to know their strengths and weaknesses, to be able to employ them correctly and give them that sense of belonging and all those things. That doesn't happen if you're changing, leaders and organizations every 3 or 4 months, just because people need to tick things in a box to get time in the troops. Like, that's not the answer. So we used to be very good at that, and now I don't think we are as good as we used to be. We need to get back to some of those basics. And I think we are. I think we're on the right road. I think we're paying attention to ourselves a little more than we did maybe in the early 2000s. But we were busy fighting a war in Afghanistan, and everyone was very, very into that. But once that ended, we forgot everything we learned before. I'm not sure if that happened after the Second World War, but I'm sure it did. Downsizing the army, doing all those things. And it's not that we were at Second World War standards or status, but we were very focused on a warfighting mission. And when the warfighting ended, what did we do in 1946, 47, 48 that, helped demobilize a huge army and just retain a core of professional soldiers and keep it professional? Sure, some of those lessons learned back then we could probably apply now.
Speaking of lessons and applying that, how are you as a senior NCO dealing with the expectations of the young soldiers who went to Afghanistan and then came back and weren't sure if they wanted to stick around the reserve?
So there's that feeling like I've done my part, and that's the only part I needed to be here for. And I mean, you can't stop that. It's a volunteer army. But there's guys who feel let down now because now we're not doing that. What am I going to do? What's going to give me? Because I mean, we're all a bit of an adrenaline junkie. And so what's the next fix? What's the next thrill? giving soldiers those things to look forward to, that's a challenge. You know, there's only so many jump courses, there's only so much mountain training you can do, there's only, you know, what is it that they want? Well, they want that feeling, but how can they get it without, I mean, we're not in a situation like that right now. But a sense of, you know, why did you, you know, the conversations I've had, why did you join in the first place? Was it just to go to Afghanistan and that's it? Then maybe you should leave. But if you joined before you thought you were going to Afghanistan, who was that guy and what was he looking for? And is that still here? Is there still those things that you can get out of it? And I think that's important. And those, you know, again, know your men, promote their welfare. Those things where you don't sit them down in an office and talk to them. That's the stuff where you're in the smoking area or you're watching guys dig trenches or do whatever, do manual labor, and then when it's coffee break and they're just standing around smoking and joking, that's when you hit those question and answer periods like, hey, Sergeant Major, what do you think of? And be open to them, because they'll ask you. Just don't lie to them, because Canadians are good at figuring out who's lying and who's telling the truth. So, yeah.
When you came back from your final tour, Afghanistan, was there decompression at that time? Was that now part of it? Wasn't, eh? Okay.
Yeah, I never had, I had 4 tours, no decompression. That's probably why I am the way I am, right? I probably could have used it, maybe, but I never did it, so I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Do you think 4 or 5 days in Cyprus would have made a difference after your first Bosnia tour?
Might have. That might have made a difference, just because it was so crappy. We were all very tight anyway, and we didn't really want to go anywhere without each other. You didn't feel safe in anyone else's company, if you know what I mean. So we were just very tight that way. And that probably would have been a good thing to do. I remember you know, we all flew home. You went home, you went back into the regiment the next day, and we worked like 3 or 4 half days before we were let go. One of those half days was, we all were sitting in the theater, in the base theater, so the whole squadron, and the psychiatrist was on the stage, and the Sergeant Major was standing over in the corner, and I remember him saying, you know, does anyone have any problems? Like, nope. So, okay, well, if you do, you know, here's my card kind of thing, and that was it. But, you know, there was guys in that squadron who've killed themselves. So, obviously, not everyone was okay. And the Sergeant Major, who was sort of like the big dad, if you want, but we didn't want to disappoint him by showing weakness or you know, the perceived weakness of saying that, you know, I can't sleep at night or I've got problems. But you know very well that that night there were guys drinking in the pub with each other and trying to deal with whatever was going on in their heads. So yeah, it was, we weren't ready for that, I don't think. I don't think Canada was ready for that. And I think we're a lot better at it now than we ever were, for sure, yeah. Yeah.
Is there, just to wrap it up, is there anything relates to these tours that you want to finish on, say, that you haven't had a chance to say yet?
Gosh, I'm not ever short of words, but I mean, being on tour, I can tell you, all 4 of them were over Christmas, and I can tell you exactly what I did on that period of time. You know what I mean? Where Christmas is at home, they seem to blend together, and I'm never really sure what year that was or this was. But those years is very clear to me, the best time of my life. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks very much.